Lazy D here. Today I'm working on this 2020 Can-Am Defender HG10 Pro. I'm sure this will apply to a lot of the Defender models. This is a bike I regularly work on. This customer recently had a service done and I cleaned this bike all up, even though it doesn't look like it. I noticed the brakes were pretty well worn the last time I saw it, so the customer took it for about another week while I sourced some brake pads for him. So it's back now. I'm going to walk you through changing the front brake pads on this side-by-side. First thing you got to do is get the front wheels off the ground. Use jack stands if you don't have a lift or something, so it's not going to fall on you. 17 millimeter lug nuts. I'm going to go ahead and take these off. Okay, now that I got the wheels off, there's two bolts that are pins that go through the brake pads here. They're T30s. I'm going to take those out. Anytime you're dealing with an Allen or a Torx head on anything that gets pretty dirty, you want to make sure these are clean all the way to the bottom. If you don't, only engage about half the whatever the socket is on your hardware, there's a good chance you could strip it and can become very frustrating. So I'm not going to take them out. I'm just going to unthread them for now. Get them backed out a little bit. And then the caliper bolts are a 15 millimeter. So I'm going to use this ratchet wrench to take those out. And now you should be able to pry this off. If your brakes are a little bit worn or the rotor's a little worn and there's a higher edge on the edge of these, of the rotors, you might have a hard time pulling these off, but you should be able to pry them off. As you can see, these brake pads, the liners in here were getting pretty thin. When they're new, I'll show you a new one before I put it on, they're quite a bit thicker. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull these pins out, and you can push back these pistons before you pull the pads out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these pads out first, and a lot of times there's a lot of crap inside. Hopefully you can see this. There's a bunch of, foxtails and dirt and crap. I don't want any of that being pushed back in with the caliper pistons, so I'm going to blow all that out before I put the pads back in and press those pistons back in. So now I'm going to go ahead and just set my pads back in real quick. Don't even have to put the pins back in. And then I have some pry bars here. I'm going to get my pry bars between these pads. You wouldn't want to do this with new pads. It might scuff them up a little bit or scrape them. But I'm just going to work the pistons back until they're all the way seated in the caliper. There's a lot of fancy tools probably for this. This works fine for me anyway. Okay, so that's all the way back. So I'm going to pull the old pads out. while you're doing your brakes, it's a good idea to inspect the rotors. You need to do this. There's a minimum thickness for these. I don't know the spec. These to me look good. There's not a lot of ridge from where the surface was new, which is this untouched surface that it hasn't made contact with. But a lot of times on side-by-sides, and another thing other than just wear of the thickness of the rotor is I'll see heat marks and then cracks that'll come from these vent holes in the rotors. So it's a good idea to take a look around and make sure there's not a lot of heat stress or little cracks starting. These look good to me still. The new pads I got are the factory pads. They're like 60 bucks a side. They're pretty expensive. If you look at them, they actually say Brembo on them. So they're made by a very reputable manufacturer. You can put cheaper pads on. I've done it plenty of times on my own bikes. This is a customer's machine. I know this guy is a rancher and he uses this very hard. So when I am quoting out a price to do brakes, I don't really give a customer like this that I know they're using it hard the option other than factory if I'm going to do it. So you can see the thickness on these. He got good life out of the old pads. So for 120 bucks, this guy's getting new pads on both sides plus my labor time. It's a pretty good deal. So just keep that in mind, the intended use of the machine. I know this guy loads up this bike with, you know, he'll put 8 or 10 bales of alfalfa in the back that way overloads this thing, and then he drives the hills to feed his beef cows. So just something to think about when you're pricing stuff out and you're doing work for people. Before I put these pads in, I got a little bit of brake lube here. This is Permatex brake parts lubricant. I'm just going to lube the outside of the caliper here, and then just the top of the piston cups. Not all, it doesn't take much. This will just prevent squeaking and accelerated wear on these parts that are not, well, I mean, they are replaceable, but you don't want to be replacing or rebuilding your calipers. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick the new pads in, and then these pins go back in. And then I'm not going to tighten the pins yet, but I'm going to get this rotor or this caliper and pads set onto the back on the rotor. Put the bolts back in, these 15 millimeters. It's starting to rain on me here. Torque for this is probably about 35 foot-pounds. I'm comfortable doing this by hand. If you're not, I'll try to look it up and put it in here. There's that, and then I got my T30s going back in. Okay, new pads are in. Something to remember when you do brakes, make sure before you drive off, you pump the brakes a couple times, because these pads are, the pistons are all the way in the calipers, and the pads aren't going to make engagement with the rotor for a few pumps of the brakes. So you want to make up that distance before you start moving. You don't want to run into a car or something in your yard or do something weird. So I hope this video was helpful to someone. Like, comment, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you.